Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf lamed bet. Today's daf is sponsored by Aviva Appelman in loving memory of her father, Joseph Appelman, Yosef ben Hillel. May his neshama have an aliyah. I'm going to just mention, I mentioned yesterday, but I know not everyone listens to every daf, so I'll be in Chicago on February 24th giving a shiur there on Mishlochei Manot and development from the Gemara to the halacha. So anyone who's around Chicago, knows people in Chicago, feel free to pass it around. You can email us if you haven't gotten the details because you don't live in Chicago. So just email us and we will send you the information to pass along. Okay. Also, Shuli Mishkin's flashback went up about, specifically about mezuzos. So recommended reading, since that's really our topic that we're dealing with for right now. So again, we're on our tangent off of the usual Menachot stuff for a while now into really getting deep into mezuzah, and today we're going to have a big comparison, mezuzah, tefillin, Sefer Torah. What are differences, similarities? Not exactly that they're tackling it in a very organized way, like, oh, let's just discuss mezuzah, tefillin, Sefer Torah, and organize what differences are, but throughout the sugya, we're going to get to different differences about them. So we started off yesterday with Rabbi Chelbo. I want you to remember this. Always that bus driver joke. What's the name of the bus driver? Later in the daf, toward the end, we're going to get to Rav Chelbo again, who's going to again tell us something that Rav Huna did. So that seems to be the structure of today's sugya, even though we're going to get far off from that throughout the sugya. So, Amar Rabbi Chelbo, 4 lines from the bottom of Lamed Aleph Amud Bet. Chazina leila Rav Huna de karech le echad klape shema. I saw 2 things Rav Huna did. One is the way he would roll his mezuzah. He would roll it from left to right, from the word echad, the end of the sentence, to till it gets to the beginning of Shema. Ve'oseh parshiotav stumot. And he would leave just a few spaces in between the parsha of Shema and Vayam Shema. I wouldn't do it like a parsha petuchot. In the Torah, there's 2 ways of doing it, of leaving a line and a lot more of a bigger break between. So he would do it stuma. Meitive, which means closed. Okay, petuchot means open. Open just means more space in between the sections. Meitive, but now we're going to ask the difficulty from a braita. It's a little bit atypical here because usually we have a problem on an amora from a braita. The word meitive says there's a braita that contradicts the amora. In this case, it's not the braita by itself. It's really the fact that Rav Huna paskins like the braita. That Rav paskins like the braita, and Rav was the rabbi of Rav Huna. That's going to be our big issue. Okay, not so much what it says in the braita, but the fact that Rav holds that way, and Rav was Rav Huna's rabbi. And what it says in that braita is going to contradict what he says, because instead of saying setumot, it's going to say petuchot. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. So first, we have a lot of people quoting other people. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is going to quote Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir haya kotva, or not quote him, but say, this is what Rabbi Meir would do. Kind of like Rabbi Chelbo said, this is what Rav Huna would do. Right, there's certain areas of halacha where you can see what people were doing, and there's certain areas of halacha where you just listen to the way they paskined. In this case, well, since they were writing mezuzahs, they were able to see what they did here. Rabbi Meir kotva al duchsustos kimin daf. Okay, let's talk about duchsustos. Duchsustos. So the Koran always has good etymology. They said it comes perhaps from do, like 2. Okay, there's 2 layers of the parchment. Okay, you can divide the hide of the animal, you can divide it into 2 layers. Okay, so we're going to discuss 4 things today. We're going to see, okay, there's 2 layers. The top layer is what we call cloth. That's the parchment used for Sefer Torah and tefillin, talking about differences between them. The inner layer is when you separate into 2 layers, the inner layer is called the duchsustos, and that's what you use for the mezuzah. Soon we're going to get into also that both the cloth and the duchsustos could be, there's 2 sides to it, because once you divide it into 2, right, there's the upper side and the low and the inner side. The side that's, we're going to call it closer to the hair and closer to the flesh. Okay, so there's basically 4 possibilities of what you could write things on. It's the cloth on the side where the hair is, the cloth on the inner side, the duchsustos, which is the inner layer, right, on the side though that's facing outward, or the side that's facing inward. Okay, they're going to call it se'ar, the side near the hair, or the side basar, near the flesh. But right now we're just talking about duchsustos in general. So he would write the mezuzah on the inner layer, not the cloth. Kimin daf, okay, like a Rashi says, like an amud sheb'sfarim arukah u'ktsara, okay, like a long narrow, the way he would write long and narrow. Ve'oseh revach milamala ve'revach milamata. He would leave a margin at the top and a margin at the bottom. Ve'oseh parshiotel petuchot. This is why we brought this. He would make this section break in between Shema and Vayam Shema a bigger break. Amarti lo. So now Rabbi Shimon Elazar is saying, Rabbi Meir would do this, and I said to him, Rabbi, matam, why do you do it like this? Meaning the parsha petuchot. Amar li ho'il ve'ein smuchot min Torah. He says, look, they're not anywhere near each other in the Torah. I mean, relatively speaking, they are, but there's a huge section in between them, right? They're not put one right after the other. One's in chapter 5, one's in chapter 11. So he says, so because they're far from each other, so I make a big break in between to show that these are not consecutive passages. Okay, so that was the braita. And now it's not that the braita itself by itself is such a difficulty, although it could be. But Amar Rav Hananel Amar Rav halakha Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. But Rav Hananel said in the name of Rav, as we said, he was Rav Huna's rabbi. We paskin like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who passed down this tradition of Rabbi Meir. Now, if you notice, there were 4 things it said here: duchsustos, like a dav, revach milamala, revach milamata, and parshiot petuchot. And we assumed, I guess, everything, including the parsha petuchot. So they say, lo, a revach. No, he wasn't talking about the parsha petuchot. He was specifically talking about the margins at the top and the bottom. That was what he was referring to when he said he paskin like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. He didn't mean about the petuchot. This is answer number 1. So now, if already we're talking about this revach, so the Gemara wants to know, v'kama revach, right? What kind of margins you're supposed to leave on the page? Amar Rav Menachot bar Yaakov, Amar la Amar Rav Shmuel bar Yaakov, kimalo at v'desifrei, like the clips of the scribes. Okay, this isn't an atav in Hebrew, modern Hebrew is a clothespin. Okay, it's like a type of clothespin they would use. What was it for? It wasn't for clothes. It was for holding down the parchment so that when you're writing, it doesn't move. So it makes sense that you would have to leave enough of a margin to fit those clips, because if you didn't, then it would move, and you can't write in that space because you're needing it for the clips. Okay, that was an aside. Comes Abaye, and Abaye wants to strengthen this reading. Amar le Abaye le Rav Yosef. He goes to Rav Yosef and he says, "Va'alo tizbarad chiyam Rav arevach." Do you not hold? Basically meaning, Abaye goes to Rav Yosef and says, "It's obvious that you agree with me, right? That." And we haven't seen Abaye yet, but he basically seems to be saying the same thing the Gemara said, which is that Rav, when he passed it like Rav Shimon ben Elazar, he must have been talking only about the space. They don't seem to relate to the duchsustos and the daf. I assume they just mean also that. But right now what they're trying to say is not the petuchot. How do I know this? Abaye says to Rav Yosef. Remember, Rav Yosef was his rabbi. How do I know this? Because harav itle minhaga ve'ha'idna naug alma b'stumot. This is a very important line. Rav itle minhaga means that when Rav sees the custom that people are doing, he generally takes that very seriously. Okay, sometimes we have situations where people generally do something and rabbis come and say, no, that's not what we do, and come out against the minhag. Rav in general always sided with, if as long as it worked, right? But he always sided with, if that's what people are doing, that must be the halacha. Okay, and again, this is a dangerous statement. You could take this to all sorts of places, but in general, when there's some sort of debate anyway, if he saw the people doing like this, he would say, oh, that must be the halacha. Okay, he took very seriously the minhag hamakom, or the minhag of the people. He felt like that shows what halacha really must be. So we're going to prove this in a minute, how we know Rav did this. But the point being, v'ha'idna nowadays, and as Abaye says, look around. Look at your mezuzahs. What do you see? Naug alma b'stumot. Everybody writes their mezuzahs stumot, with a small break in between the 2 paragraphs. So it can't possibly be, he says, it just doesn't make any sense, that Rav would have a psak that goes against the custom that the people are doing. So therefore, it must be that when Rav passed like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, he was only talking about the fact of leaving margins. That's what Abaye says. So now we have to explain, how do we know that Rav always follows the custom? And for this, we're going to talk about the issue of chalitzah. Chalitzah, man dies without children. The wife is supposed to marry the brother. If she doesn't want to marry, or the brother doesn't want to marry her, they do the ceremony of chalitzah. And basically, there's the shoe, right? She takes off her shoe, she spits on it, and says, this person, right, doesn't want to continue his brother's name. Anyway, they use a shoe. What kind of shoe? Generally a sandal. The question is, can you use a shoe as well? So now comes this very interesting statement of Rav. And this is going to prove that Rav takes minhag hamakom very seriously, or minhag of the community. Amar Rabba, Amar Rav Kahana, Amar Rav. We're going to have two statements in the name of Rav Kahana and the name of Rav. One Rabba is going to say and one Rav Yosef is going to say. They're both going to indicate the same thing, but there's one big difference between them that's really not relevant to our purposes, but the Gemara is going to point out, okay, well, what's the difference between the two of them? So he said, Im Yavo, so this is Rabba's version of it. Im Yavo Eliyahu v'yomal. If Eliyahu Hanavi shows up one day and tells us, right, he's the one who's supposed to tell us all the, right, Teku is, it's not really an acronym, but people use it as an acronym for Tishbi Yitaretz Kushiyot Ubayot, right? It really means Tikom, it will stand until we have clarification. But also, right, he's the person who's known to answer all the halachic questions, or, maybe come and say something's different than what you've been doing. So if you were to come and say, Chotzim b'min'al, you can actually use a shoe for chalitzah, then shomin lo, we can listen to him. Now what does this infer? It infers people don't think you could use a shoe for chalitzah, and if Eliyahu were to come and say you can, so we could do that. Okay, that doesn't go against the minhag, because it's not like we have a minhag not to use shoes, right? Our minhag is what? Our minhag is to use a sandal. Okay, so if he comes and says you can also use a shoe, that's fine. We can listen to him. Ein chotzim sandal, but if he says you cannot do chalitzah with a sandal, ein shomin lo, we don't listen to him. This is fascinating. Eliyahu comes and tells us this is the halacha, you can't use a sandal. People have been using sandals for thousands of years, okay? Shekvar nahagua sandal, look, that's been the custom for the last 2,000 years. We're not going to let Eliyahu come and change that, okay? See, he wasn't talking about 2,000 years at that point, but, right? So basically, if Eliyahu were to come and say, I'm changing from the prevalent custom, we don't listen to Eliyahu. Okay, and the same thing from Rav Yosef. He's just going to change one thing. Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Kahana, Amar Rav. So now it's the, right, Rav and Rav Yosef were counterparts, right, at the same time. He quotes Rav Kahana as saying in the name of Rav, Im Yavo Eliyahu v'yomar ein chotzim b'min'al shom'in lo. If Eliyahu were to come and say you cannot use a shoe for chalitzah, we can listen to him. Why? Because no one's really using a shoe anyway. Okay, but ein chotzim b'sandal, if he says don't use a sandal, ein shomin lo, that we don't listen to. Again, that part was the same thing. Don't use the sandal. We don't listen to him. Shekvar nahagoam b'sandal. V'amrina. Okay, so basically that proved our point that Rav takes minhag very seriously, to the extent that if Eliyahu were to come and say, don't do the custom that the people have been doing, we don't actually listen to him. V'amrina my benayu. And then they say, okay, so what's the difference, Rabba, Rav Yosef? So min al lechatchila ika benayu. I don't know if you caught this, but one said, if he comes and says you can wear a shoe, meaning he's changing it from what we do now, meaning nowadays you can't wear a shoe. You can't use a shoe for chalitzah. Sorry, I didn't mean wear a shoe. Use a shoe for chalitzah. So again, if you go with Rav Yosef, he said if Eliyahu were to come and say you can't use a shoe, but nowadays we can use a shoe, right? Or we think you can use a shoe. Nobody really does. But you could use a shoe nowadays. And according to Rabbah, if Eliyahu were to come and say you can use a shoe, because nowadays we don't use a shoe. So the difference between them is, what's the halacha nowadays? Is the halacha that you can't use a shoe? Is the halacha that you can use a shoe? Again, nobody's really using shoes anyway. But the point is, what do we think the halacha is nowadays? Lechatchila, okay, that's what we're saying here. Min al lechatchila ika benayu. Can you use a shoe, ideally, if you want? Okay? So if you go into a court and you want to do chalitzah, is it permissible to use a shoe? Well, according to Rav Yosef, yes. Because Rav Yosef's whole thing is if he comes and says, don't use a shoe, we'll believe him, because anyway, people aren't using shoes. But they can if they want to. The other one was saying if Eliyahu comes and says you can't, because nowadays, theoretically, if you can, we don't listen to him because, right, did I say that right? Rabbah said, if he tells you yes, you can, because Rabbah thinks you can't. And Rav Yosef says, you actually can today, and therefore if he tells you you can't, you can listen to him, because that's changing the halacha. Each one is talking about Eliyahu saying something against what we think now we're supposed to do. Okay, so the main point being, can you or can't you use a shoe? That's the machlokah between them. But that wasn't really why we brought this. We brought this all just because we wanted to see the custom of how Rav won't go against the prevalent custom, even if Eliyahu tells us. That's a real extreme right, situation, because he's the one who's supposed to be the one telling us what really God wants from us. So that's a whole other interesting question about Torah Shabbat Peh in general and custom, what people do and how much strength that has. Okay, point being, this was all brought to tell us, if you remember, that it can't possibly be that Rav held like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar on the issue of setumot, or petuchot, because everybody's mezuzahs have its setumot, and there's no way Rav went against the prevalent custom. Okay, now that was the first resolution to the question. If you remember, okay, elalav shmamina arevach shmamina. So conclusion must be that when Rav said I paskin like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, he was only talking about the issue of the margins. And that resolves the difficulty that we thought Rav said petuchot and Rav Huna, his student, said setumot. How could that be? Because Rav really didn't paskin on the issue of the petuchot. That wasn't what he was talking about. Here's a second resolution. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, mitzvah la'asotam setumot, v'yavdinu petuchot shapir dami. It's ideal that you should do setumot, and that explains why all the people are doing setumot, even though Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said petuchot. But what he meant was, okay, and we'll see in a minute. First, we're just going to say what the halach is. If you do petuchot, according to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, if you were to leave a big space in between the two sections, it's still valid. Umay petuchot ka'amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. So when Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said that Rabbi Meir would do them petuchot, what he meant was af petuchot, even petuchot. He didn't mean not setumot. Petuchot means you can also do them petuchot. You just don't have to. Right? The ideal really is to do it setumot, and that's why everybody, it's customary, right? You see all the mezuzahs, they're setumot. But if you want to do petuchot, it's fine. So we're rereading Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar to fit with, and then you could say that Rav really does paskin like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar on all these issues. It's just that what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar meant is not what we thought. What he meant was you can also do petuchot. Okay, that's his answer. Now we're going to try. So we have two answers. Either Rav really didn't hold like him, or he did. It's just we're reinterpreting what he said. So now they want to bring a proof for this reading of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak from a braita. But in the end, we're going to reject it. And then we're going to get off on a tangent on this braita. Lema misayale. Let's suggest that this braita supports it. Kayotzebo. Sefer Torah Shabbalah utfilin Shabbalu. Okay, there's a continuation of something. I didn't check what it is. It's a Gemara in Shvat. It's a braita that's quoted there. Sefer Torah Shabbalah utfilin Shabbalu. If you have an old Sefer Torah or old tefillin that are worn out and not in good shape, ein osim mehem mezuzah. You cannot turn them into a mezuzah. Okay, what would you do? You cut out the parchment that has, for tefillin, depending on whether it's tefillin shel yad or rosh, and it's one cloth or separate klafim, but theoretically, right, let's say it was one long cloth, so you could cut those two sections, because there's 4 sections in the tefillin. You cut the 2 sections, and you'd say, I'll use this for my mezuzah, or take a Sefer Torah, cut out the part that says Shema, cut out the part that says Vayam Shema, and put it in your mezuzah. So you can't do that. Why can't you do it? This is what's important. I told you we're going to talk a lot about differences between Sefer Torah, tefillin, and mezuzah today. One of the things we're going to see here is that they have a higher standard of sanctity than a mezuzah. Okay? So now, say, you can't be morid from kedusha chamura to kedusha kala. You can't turn something that had the sanctity of a Sefer Torah, sanctity of tefillin, and then bring it down to be a mezuzah because it's not respectful. Okay, that statement really means a lot more than what it means, because ha-moridin osim. What it seems to imply, though, is if it wasn't an issue of lahorid mikdusha chamura to kedusha kala, you actually could take the pieces from the Sefer Torah and put them in your mezuzah. Okay, you would have to sew them together because it has to be one piece, but basically you could do it. Now, I just want to remind you, because we're going to keep going back to this inference, you can't do it. But you can't do it for a very particular reason, because of this taking high level sanctity and lowering it to a lower level sanctity. But if it wasn't an issue, let's say a mezuzah had the same level sanctity, it sounds like you could do it. This is going to infer what? Amai. Now they're going to say, wait a minute. But if you say that, okay, let's just talk about a Sefer Torah. The section after Shema has a parsha stuma, and the section before Vayam Shema, which is what you're going to have there, right, in between the two, if you cut and paste, you're going to end up, or cut and sew, you're going to end up with a stuma there and a stuma before vayayim shamoa. So you're going to end up with a break of a stuma. And if he said petuchot, and it has to be petuchot, if we understand petuchot, it has to be. So hacha stuma v'hacha petuchot. You wouldn't be able to, again, theoretically, take the mezuzah, right, the sections from the Torah and put them together, because you're going to end up with a stuma break and not a petuchah break, right? Not enough of a break in between. So if Rabbi Shimon and Elazar really meant, and Rav Paskin like that you have to have it petuchot, then there's no way you would have said, Eino Seimei mezuzah, because this is petuchah and this is stuma. Okay, and that's not what it says. It says because you just, right, theoretically it could be done, it's just that we're lowering the sanctity. So that would be a proof for Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak that he doesn't really mean it has to be petuchot. He meant it could even be petuchot. And then obviously here, in this case, it would be setumot, and that would be perfect, because that's the ideal anyway. To which they answer, no, that source doesn't prove anything, because when we said, Dilma lahashlim, maybe what it means is, if you have a worn out Sefer Torah and you want to use it for your mezuzah, maybe it means like you have a line that's messed up in your mezuzah, and you want to cut that line out of the Torah, sew it into your mezuzah in its right place, but not necessarily that we need to take the whole section and put it in your mezuzah. So if we understand it that way, then it doesn't really teach us anything about the section breaks. So, okay, that was an attempt to prove Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, failed attempt. So basically what we have until this point, just to keep reviewing so we keep the structure in place, Rabbi Chelbo came and talked about the minhag of Rav Huna, about rolling, and about specifically that what interested us was the setumot. We raised a difficulty from Rav, who holds, like Rabbi Shimon and Elazar, who holds petuchot. But then we said, no. Either Rav didn't really paskin on that issue, he was only paskining on one of the other issues on the margins, or Rabbi Shimon and Elazar didn't really mean petuchot, he meant even petuchot. But now that we brought this braita, we're now going to delve into this braita and this assumption that we made from that braita that the Gemara has all sorts of difficulties with, right? And as you say something, and I've seen it in the chat, some people like, said this, but that's what about something else we learned? This doesn't seem to work. So once they mention this braita, basically they say, wait a minute, we're now going to have two difficulties that start out with these words. It's going to be the third time. We're going to do all together 3 times deal with this inference. One was to try to say, maybe we could prove from this braita Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, in the end we didn't. But we're going to say another issue about this inference. Wait a minute, we're going to have 2 difficulties now. If it weren't for the issue of lowering from high level sanctity from high level to low level, you could actually cut out from a Sefer Torah and put it in a mezuzah. Wait a minute, Hatanya, isn't there a braita that says Halakha Moshe Sinai? It's an old tradition. Okay, right. Halakha Moshe Sinai puts us somewhere in between Doraita and Derabanan. Okay, more serious than Derabanan, not exactly written in the Torah, but close to. Usually it's something also that there's no debate about, not always, but most of the time. Tfilin ala klaf, umezuzah al duchsustos. This is what we talked about before. The mezuzah is written on the inner layer, and the Sefer Torah and the Tefillin are written on the outer layer. They're written on a completely different piece of parchment. So a different type of parchment. So how can you possibly take a Sefer Torah, cut out that parchment, and use it in the mezuzah when the mezuzah needs the duchsustos and not the cloth? And not only that, but cloth bimkom basal, duchsustos bimkom seal. And not only that, as I said before, we're going to also have which side of the hide you use. So this is going to be on the upper, you use the inner side, on the inner, you use the upper side. Okay, that's the easy way to remember it. On the cloth, which is the outer layer, you use the side that's by the flesh, the inner side. And on the mezuzah, on the duchsustos, you use the inner layer, but the top part of the inner layer. How can you cut a Sefer Torah? Because it's a Sefer Torah that's worn. Okay, it's worn and it's no good and it's disqualified. Like, as a whole, it can't be used. So then we want to use it theoretically. That's what we're saying. The whole issue is why'd you ask? How can you use it? Because, right, we have this concept. Once something's high-level sanctity, you can't lower it. That's exactly what they're saying. You can't use it for a mezuzah because it would be lowering its sanctity. Okay? But were it not for that, theoretically, you could. Because anyway, it can't be used as a Sefer Torah anymore. So let's say, right, the rest of it is not good, but the section of Shema is good. Right? So theoretically, you should be able to take that and use it. Okay, so now we say it's written on the other thing, right? So therefore, how can you say that? To which they say, lemitzvah. Okay. The way that we deal with the which is written on which, that's all the ideal, okay? But if you use cloth for mezuzah, that would work. To which the Gemara says, how could you possibly suggest that? Okay, and then basically that was to resolve the question. but difficulty on this answer because Hatanya, there's braita that says shina pasul. If you switch it, it's disqualified. I said, no, that's bitfilin. Okay, there's two directions. Mezuzah can use cloth, and therefore you could take a tefillin and put it in the mezuzah, or take the Sefer Torah, and again, only theoretically, you really can't, but theoretically, were it not for the lowering of sanctity, you could. But tefillin, you can't use the duchsustos. Okay? That can't be used. That's what it means, shina pasul. Okay, we resolved that difficulty. Now the Torah says, but wait, I've got another difficulty. There's another braita that says, v'hatanya, shina bein bezeh pasul. If you change either this or that. Now, what do you think it means, either this or that? It must mean either mezuzah or tefillin. Either one that you change is going to be an issue. To which the Gemara says, no. Idi v'idi b'tefillin. No. You really could use the cloth for the mezuzah. Theoretically, right? You could, if you wanted to. And that would explain why theoretically, and practically you can use cloth for mezuzah. Ideally not, but you can. That's why theoretically you could have moved the tefillin to the mezuzah. Other than, I'm going to keep reminding you, other than the fact that you can't, because you can't lower the level of sanctity. When it says shina bein bezeh pasul, what did it mean? Idi v'idi b'tefillin. It was talking about two cases of tefillin. This can't be changed to that, and this can't be changed to that. What would that be? One is if you flip, because remember, there's two things which are really four. You have to do the tefillin on the cloth on the inner side, right, on the basar side. So if you did it on the cloth on the outer side, b'mkom se'al, disqualified. That's bein bezeh, that's the one case, is pasul. And had katfinu, turning out amubet, duchsustos b'mkom basar. The other is, what if you use the duchsustos? You had it on the makom basar, the inner part of it, of the parchment, but you use the inner layer of the parchment, which is not the layer you're supposed to use. So you did use the right side, but the wrong one. That's what it means, bein bezeh. That's at least a way to interpret it, to not contradict and say, mezuzah though, if you use cloth, it would be okay. Because if we say bein bezeh has everything to do with tefillin and not mezuzah, then we're good. Okay, that's one way to read it. Or, if you still want to say, well, bein bezeh, maybe you'd say it's bein mezuzah, bein tefillin is disqualified. How can we still say what we said, which is, and again, you theoretically could have used this piece for the mezuzah. Why? Because maybe it's true the braita says if you change both the mezuzah or the tefillin, it's no good. But that's a machloket, tanaim. Okay? One opinion says it's no good, and one opinion says it is good. And our source, which said you can't do it because it's lowering level of sanctity of the cloth, is obviously holding bein bezeh, right? That it could work for mezuzah. Okay, and doesn't hold bein bezeh is pasul. How do we know this? It's not just they're throwing this out as an idea, but they're going to bring a braita that proves that there's a machloket tanaim about it. And then we just say each source disagrees, agrees with a different tana. Titanya, shina bezeh pasul. Okay, that's the one that we saw before. Rabbi Acha machshir mishum Rabbi Achai Rabbi Chanina v'amri la mishmei Rabbi Akiva Rabbi Chanina. Okay, he quotes somebody, but Rabbi Acha says it's fine. If you change from the mezuzah, you put the mezuzah on the cloth, it's fine, and then that resolves our difficulty. So we have two ways to resolve the difficulty. Either there's actually no source that thinks it's a problem for mezuzah, it's only a problem for tefillin. Tefillin has to be on exactly on the right piece of parchment on the right side. The mezuzah doesn't. Or you say there's a machloket tanaim about it, and our source follows the opinion that's more lenient. Okay. Now we're going to get to our second difficulty on this inference. And then finally, we'll get back to Rabbi Chelbo, who's going to tell us another thing that Rav Huna did. Okay, and this is going to end our section. Ha-moridin osim, wait a minute. If it wasn't an issue of moridin, right, and let's say you could lower in sanctity, you could use the same cloth from a Sefer Torah or a tefillin, specifically we're going to talk about tefillin here, as a mezuzah. What about another difference in halacha between mezuzah and tefillin? Ha-moridin osim, v'ha-Abaye sirtut. A mezuzah needs lines on it. Okay? You need to put lines and use those lines to keep it very straight. Okay, there's a footnote in the Torah that talks about why there's a difference between tefillin and mezuzah in this case. I wanted to just read it to you because I think it's interesting. Basically, they say the reason, they call it scoring, that's a better word. The reason for scoring is to straighten the writing, to preserve its beauty. Okay, well, why wouldn't tefillin need beauty then? So they say here that since the tefillin are not designed to be read because they're covered with the hide and sewn up, then you don't need it. Whereas a mezuzah, first of all, you're supposed to, right, you can open it anytime you want and read it. And, okay, so that's the Meiri quoting the Rambam. Others say that you check the mezuzah once every 7 years, and tefillin only need to be checked once every 50 years. So also it's less likely anyone's going to really read them very often. So because of that, they say those are two possible reasons for the difference between the tefillin and the mezuzah. Okay, so that's why the mezuzah needs sirtut. By the way, Sefer Torah does need sirtut also, just so you know. But this is specifically talking about the issue of the tefillin becoming mezuzah. So you can't possibly take tefillin and turn it into mezuzah if you need the lines. It doesn't have lines. How can you just take it, right? It's not like we're going to add the lines. The whole purpose of the lines is for when you write it that it's all straight. So, which is interesting, by the way, if we talk about how mezuzah has less sanctity than the tefillin, in the end, though, the mezuzah has to be more beautiful looking than the tefillin, which, as we gave some possible reasons. So now we're going to say, how do we know it needs sirtut? Because we're going to quote someone who says it needs sirtut. To Amar Rav Menyumi Bar Chukya, Amar Rav Chama Bar Guria, Amar Rav, again quoting Rav, Kol mezuzah she'ena mesurtetet psula. Okay, not only do you need it, but it's disqualified if it doesn't have it. But Rav Menyumi Bar Chukya Didei Amar, okay, he quoted first, right, Rav Chama Bar Guria, who said in the name of Rav, but then he himself said, Sirtut shel mezuzah l'chala Moshe Sinai. And he said, not only that, it's halacha Moshe Sinai, again strengthening how important it is. To which they answered, no, that's not a difficulty, because Tanaihi, this also is a subject of Tanaitic debate. Tanya, we're going to see now a Tanaitic source about this. Rabbi Yirmiyah Omer Mishum Rabbeinu. This is not the Rabbi Yirmiyah we know. There's a Rabbi Yirmiyah in the Mishnah. Tefillin umezuzot nichtavot shalom nachtav ve'ein srichot sirtut. Okay, so here we quote a Tanaitic opinion. We're assuming that Rav must have held by a different Tanaitic opinion. But it says here, Tefillin umezuzot are written, not min haktav. What does that mean? It means when the sofer writes it, doesn't have to be looking at a different text that's written and copying, okay, writing like the way they would do ancient texts, right? You'd have a text in front of you and you copy it word for word, and that's how you have to do a Sefer Torah, but you don't have to do tefillin and mezuzah in that way, which we'll see in a minute why. And they both don't need sirtut, not the tefillin, not the mezuzah. So that would be another way to explain that Tanaitic source that we saw, right? We could say, or that would be the way to explain it, that it holds by this other opinion. The hilchata, just by the way, if you're interested, the Gemara tells us the halacha is tefillin lo bayis sirtut umezuzah bayis sirtut. Okay, so even though that source seemed to indicate that mezuzah wouldn't need sirtut, but we paskin that mezuzah does need sirtut. V'idi nichtavot shalom nachtav, but neither of them need to be copied from a different text. My taima migros krisin, because everybody knows the words in the mezuzah and in the tefillin. Now mezuzah more likely because it's the two sections of Shema that we say twice a day. So everybody knows those words, so you don't need to have the text in front of you. But even tefillin, I guess also for sofrim who write them all the time, right? Even if you write Sefer Torah all the time, you don't remember the whole Torah. But this is two more sections. It's not like there's so much to remember. Anyway, these are well-known, and maybe in those days people knew those psukim by heart also. They're well-known sections of the Torah. Everybody knows them by heart. That's why you don't need to copy them. Okay, that's a side point. And this was all, again, two difficulties off of that braita that we brought. The inference we made from the braita that we brought to try to prove Menachot bar Yitzchak, to the end didn't prove him, and that was the second resolution to the difficulty against Rav Huna and what he did with the setumot. So once we got there, we had two difficulties on that inference, and now we're done with that section. So now, as I promised, we were going to get back to Rav Chelbo. Amar Rav Chelbo, ana chazite le Rav Huna. Again, another thing he saw Rav Huna doing. Davayativ apuria de Sefer Torah ale. He sat on a bed where there was a Sefer Torah on it, but he didn't really, don't worry. Vikaf lechada a'ara, what he did is, and it's when he wanted, I think what they really mean is when he wanted to sit on a bed that there was a Sefer Torah on, okay, you would have just said, go sit somewhere else. Okay, but obviously there wasn't anywhere else to sit, so what did he do? It's going to sound a little strange. Chaf lechada a'ara, he put a jug upside down on the floor, Va'ana chale Sefer Torah, and put it on top of the jug. Okay, try to imagine a Sefer Torah on a jug. It doesn't seem to work. Maybe a gigantic jug. Some of the commentaries, some of the Girsaot have kal instead of kad, which makes a lot more sense. You can see why Reish and Dalet get switched. Kar is a pillow. Okay, some sort of pillow. Again, I don't think they meant a pillow like a pillow, but they put something on the ground so that the Torah would be off the ground, and put the Torah on there, and that way he was able to go sit down on the bed. So what does he obviously hold here? And this is the basis for famous halacha that you shouldn't sit on a bench or a chair or somewhere where there's a Sefer Torah, where there's not just a Sefer Torah, but a chumash or a siddur, right? People are very careful not to do that. It comes from here. So he says, Kasaval, he must have held asur le'sheva gabei mitash Sefer Torah munach aled. You can't sit on a bed where there's a Sefer Torah on it. Upliga de Rabbi Bar Chana, but he disagrees with Rabbi Bar Chana because Rabbi Chana didn't think there was an issue, and we're going to hear an interesting story. To Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he quotes in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Mutar le'sheva gabei mitash Sefer Torah munach aled. You can actually sit on a bed. He doesn't think there's an issue at all. You can sit on a bed where there's a Sefer Torah. It's not disrespectful. Ve'im l'chshecha adam lomao, and if someone were to whisper to you and say, no way, no how, and I'll tell you why, because of Maaseh Rabbi Elazar, Shaya Yoshev al Amita, there was a case of Rabbi Elazar who was sitting on a bed, Viniskal, and all of a sudden he remembered, Sefer Torah munach aleh, I don't know exactly what that means, but I think it means he realized, not he remembered, but all of a sudden he realized it was Sefer Torah. I guess when he sat down he didn't realize. Vinishmat v'yashav gabei akarka, he quickly got off the bed, sat on the ground, v'domeh kemishet kishon nachash, and he looked so white in the face, right? He got terribly faint, or like someone who was bitten by a snake. In other words, he was horrified by what had just happened, that he had sat on this bed with the Sefer Torah. At least that's what, in other words, comes Rabbi Bar Chana says, if someone's to tell you this story and say, look, you're wrong, and you can't sit on the bed with the Sefer Torah, because look at what happened in this story with Rabbi Elazar, and he was, white in the face and was shocked that he had just sat in a bed and was, horrified is the word, that he just sat on the bed with the Sefer Torah. But you got the facts wrong. Hatam Sefer Torah gabei karka. There the Sefer Torah was on the floor, and that's why he was so shocked. Now, it's a little hard to say the story was the Sefer Torah. Didn't he say he sat on the bed and he realized the Sefer Torah was on the bed? So how could you say the Sefer Torah was on the floor? So some of the commentaries say what it means is the bed had kind of two levels or two sections of it. One part was much, much closer to the floor. And then when he sat down, he realized that in the lower part of the bed was the Sefer Torah, and that was what was bothering him. That he was higher than the Sefer Torah was, and the Sefer Torah was close to the floor, and that's what horrified him. Right? Could you imagine if you saw a Sefer Torah on the floor, right? You'd also be horrified as if you'd seen a snake, right? It's a big deal. So that's what shocked him, and it has nothing to do with the fact that he was on the bed with the Sefer Torah. That just happened to be when he noticed how low the Sefer Torah was, or maybe that he was up and the Sefer Torah was lower. Again, it's unclear exactly the details of the story and what he meant, but he basically has no issue with this whole thing. Amal Rav Yudah Amar Shmuel. Back to details of mezuzah. Okay, so again, we have Rabbi Chelbo, who saw, if we just review the structure right now, okay, and then we won't review at the end because we're almost at the end anyway. Rabbi Chelbo sees Rav Huna, who does these two things, and the one that really focused on was the setumot. We had a whole long discussion of that, which got us off on a tangent about this case about turning a Sefer Torah or tefillin into a mezuzah, and some halachic issues that maybe would come up in addition to the ones mentioned in the braita, two difficulties on that braita. And again, there were two resolutions to the contradiction about the setumot in general, right? Whether Rav really didn't hold that way, or whether he meant even petuchot, but obviously setumot, and then it doesn't contradict. And now we're up to the second thing of Rabbi Chelbo about the Sefer Torah, and here we just brought this contradictory opinion. Okay, there's one opinion that says this, that you can't, and one opinion that says you can sit on the bed. Now we're going to see, and that's all really here, it has to do with Sefer Torah, but it's also because Rabbi Chelbo said, I saw Rav Huna doing this. Okay, because we're really in mezuzah, but mezuzah connects with Sefer Torah, so it's not so out there. Amar Rav Yudah Amar Shmuel. Back to mezuzah. Ketava igeret psula. If you write it like a letter, it's disqualified. Rashi explains what's like a letter. Well, either below sirtut, you don't make the lines, because that's, when you write a letter, you don't really care if it's a little off the lines. And lo dikdik b'chaserot v'yaterot. And when you write a letter, if you write in Hebrew ever, sometimes people use yuds and vavs, sometimes they don't, right? Those are often silent letters, and you can do it without. But in a mezuzah, you have to be careful about doing it the right way, the way the Torah writes it. Okay, so you have to write either with the yud or without the yud, or with the vav, without the vav, depending on what the Torah says. In a letter, you don't really have to be so careful. My taima, where do we learn it from? Because ktiva ktiva mi sefer. Because we learn this ktiva from the sefer, right? Ktiva, write them on your mezuzot, and in other places like by get and by the Ketov Zot Zikaron B'Sefer in Amalek, and also in writing a Sefer Torah. We saw this last time. We had the Ktiva. There was Machlok of Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam. Which Ktiva are we talking about? But either which way, one of these Ktivot also says Sefer, and in a Sefer, meaning like a Sefer Torah, has to have all the right letters. V'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, another thing he says, Tila'ah b'makel psula. If you hang your mezuzah in a stick, like hollow out a stick, hang it in the stick, but don't put it into the wall, right? We always affix our mezuzahs to the doorpost. But if you just have it hanging there, psula doesn't work. My time, bisharecha be'inan, because it needs to be in your gates. Notice the word bisharecha, put on right on your mezuzot. In your gates. In your gates means physically in the gate, okay? Not hanging near the gate. Tanya namihach, here's a braita to support. Tla'ah b'makel o shenicha achar edelet, two issues. Either you hung it in this hollowed out stick, or you put it behind the door. There's a big debate what exactly this means. Okay, it could mean not even on the doorpost, but kind of in your house, behind the door. Different ways of understanding it. Sakana ve'ein ba mitzvah. This is dangerous, and you don't get the mitzvah. Okay, what is dangerous about this? So Rashi says, what's dangerous? Well, since it's not a mezuzah, what do mezuzahs do, according to what you've heard before? They protect you from evil spirits. So Rashi says it's dangerous because mina mizikin. Because now, ein habayit mishtamer ba'ad shik be'ena b'tzurat ha'petach hilchata. If you don't do it halachically, you're not getting the protection. That's what Rashi understands as sakana. Rabbeinu Tam goes to bat against Rashi and says, no way, no how is that what this is talking about? He says it's dangerous because you have a thing hanging. You're going to walk in the door and it's going to hit you on the head. So he says physical danger, and the other one says spirits danger. I'm glad to see you all laughing. Yes, I find it also amusing. Okay. Shalbeit mumbas hamelech hayu osim. By the way, Tosfot also claims, which I didn't really understand because it's hard to understand. There's different opinions about what exactly means inside. But he also says that if you put it inside, it's also going to hit you because you're not expecting it there, or because somehow it would also. But I find that harder to understand. Okay, shal mumbas hamelech hayu osim. This is a custom that Mumbaz the king. You can read up in the Quran about some background on it. Hayu osim, or you can Google it. Hayu osim bepundakotehem ken zecher lemezuzah. When they would go to a pundak, like an inn, a motel, they would bring these mezuzahs in a little stick, or however you call it, and they would hang it on the wall there. They wouldn't affix it to the doorpost because then it would be permanent. They would be able to take it with them, but they would hang it like that to remember the mitzvah mezuzah, which is very interesting because you're not chayav in mezuzah unless you're there for 30 days. But yes. It reminds me, my brother-in-law once got us a mezuzah for the car, like a kind of cute thing. So yeah, it's like that. V'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, mitzvah lanicha b'toch chalalo shel petach. You have to put it in the space of the doorpost. Okay, so the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? B'sharecha Amar Rachmana, what else would you be thinking? Sal kadat hachamina hu'il v'amarav mitzvah lanicha b'tefach hasamuch l'reshut harabim. You're supposed to put it in the doorpost within a tefach of, let's say you have a very wide doorpost, close to the public domain, for the outside of your entrance. Kama de merchak ma'ale, you might have thought maybe you can even put it outside because it needs to be closer to the outside. Kama shmalan, that you can't put it outside your doorpost, outside the frame. It has to be in the frame, even though it has to be closer to the outside of your house, but inside the frame. Okay, and that's what he was trying to tell us. Okay, that's it for today. So the review we kind of did already. Rav Chelbo, these two things he said about Rav Huna, one about setumot, one about the Sefer Torah on the bed, and then we got back to mezuzah, about different things, about how to write it, like an igeret is no good. Also, you can't hang it and hang it from the wall. It has to be affixed to the wall, has to be in the right spot, which we said is within the frame of the doorpost, but closer to the public domain side if you have a big wide doorpost. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.